United States President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Union Premier Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, on December 8, 1987. The treaty was an agreement to withdraw nuclear-capable intermediate and short-range ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles from Europe. The Soviet Union's destabilizing deployment of the SS-20 IRBM to Europe, along with the U.S. countermove of deploying ground-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles and the Pershing II MRBM, served as the main motivation for this treaty and was greeted by large-scale public protests in West Germany. In 2019, both the United States and Russia scrapped this treaty after the United States accused Russia of violating it. As a result, both the United States and Russia are currently deploying systems that this treaty once banned, with the United States making this announcement at the Washington NATO Summit on July 9 through 11, 2024. The United States announced its intention to withdraw from the INF Treaty on February 2, 2019, when it submitted its 6-month notice of withdrawal from the treaty. The United States claimed that the Russians had violated Article 15 of the treaty by not destroying missile systems that it forbade. In particular, the United States cited the lack of treaty compliance surrounding the destruction of the SSC-8 ground-launched intermediate-range cruise missile. The U.S. protests over the SSC-8 started in 2013, and despite efforts to demand that Russia address the material breach of the agreement, the Russians refused to comply. The U.S. withdrawal took effect on August 2, 2019. The U.S. withdrawal from the treaty coincided with a request from the U.S. Defense Department to fund IRBM missiles in 2019 as part of the 2020 fiscal year budget. The timing of the withdrawal and the 2020 defense appropriations on the surface seem to indicate that the U.S. needed to be out of the treaty before the start of the 2020 U.S. federal budget year. It is simple to make that claim by connecting the dots, but since the issue has been ongoing since 2013, the comparison and claim are not supported. The United States did need to be out of the treaty before the 2020 fiscal year, but the Defense Department request was part of a decision to address a capability gap that appeared with the Russian head start on the development and deployment of the SSC-8 cruise missile. The Russians have also made additional decisions beyond the SSC-8 by developing and deploying the SS-26 Stone, the NATO designation, or the Russian designation 9Ku-270 Iskander, a short-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile. The Russians have deployed this weapon throughout European Russia, including in Ukraine, the Russian Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad, the Leningrad military district, and they have even threatened to deploy it close to the Finnish NATO border. The United States responded to Russian deployments of the SS-26 and SSC-8 with a decision announced at the Washington NATO Summit. The United States announced that it and Germany had reached an agreement to deploy new U.S. missile systems to Germany. The U.S. intends to introduce a new land-based missile system, a medium-range missile launch system inspired by the U.S. Navy's vertical launchers on its warships. The Typhoon medium-range capability, also known as MRC, will enable the U.S. Army to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles and a ground version of the Navy standard SM-6 multiple capability missile. The U.S. Army MRC will give it a potential nuclear capability and a ballistic missile strike capability that it has not had since the implementation of the INF Treaty. When the new longer-range U.S. hypersonic missile is ready for deployment, it is expected the Typhoon system will be capable of launching it as well. The missiles are not intended to be permanently deployed, but they can be deployed on a rotating basis or when tensions in the region require the deployment of such a weapon system. The decision to deploy the weapon system to Germany has been controversial, but it hasn't reached the level of the European nuclear protests of the 1980s, at least not yet. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, and German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius welcomed the U.S. rotating deployment as an important step to fill a gap in the German defense capability. This stance by Germany is significant as it acknowledges its reliance on the United States to continue subsidize its defense needs, a need it appears unable or unwilling to fulfill on its own. The U.S. decision will allow the U.S. to extend its influence into German defense decisions as well. This acceptance by Germany of U.S. missiles follows a German rejection of French President Emmanuel Macron's proposal of deploying French nuclear-capable cruise missiles to Germany to use the French nuclear assets to defend Europe and make the European Union a de facto nuclear power. The United States administration has once again used its position in defense matters to undercut the French efforts. This followed the 2023 decision by the administration, along with the United Kingdom, to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. This offer led to the cancellation of a French diesel submarine contract between France and Australia, as well as a rift between France and the United States. Germany's decision demonstrates that Chancellor Olaf Scholz is willing to align Germany closer to the United States, but at the expense of pursuing tighter integration within the European Union. This is, of course, a change in German foreign policy under former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and her close ties with French President Macron. Merkel and Scholz belong to different political blocs, which could potentially explain some of the changes. However, it's more likely that these changes are a result of the Ukraine war and Germany's long-standing neglect of its defense sector and military forces. The perceived immediacy of the new Russian threat to Europe has made Germany realize it has serious security gaps that have formed over decades, and it needs the United States more than it needs closer relations with France. France, especially under President Macron, has been seeking ways to undercut the U.S. influence in the world, especially within Europe, in a new modern-day pursuit of Gaullism. This does not imply that the United States and France are rivals in the same way as the United States and China or the United States and Russia. Both France and the United States have largely the same goal in the world, but they have tensions about how to get there. France's position in Europe and the world has been dramatically reduced after its defeat and occupation in 1940 and the dominance of the U.S. in Europe after World War II, which has put France in a historically reduced position in geopolitics and especially European politics by a non-European country. France has a vision of making Europe on the same level as China and the United States that was once shared by Germany. But just as Macron is politically weakened domestically, the change in Germany to align closer to the U.S. than to France is another setback, and he is seeing that goal fade into the background by events of the Ukraine war and China's aggressive actions in Asia. It is too early to determine the public reaction in Germany to the decision to deploy U.S. nuclear-capable missiles again. While the CDU-CSU opposition parties endorsed Chancellor Scholz's decision, the Greens and FDP and Scholz's SPD-led coalition initially opposed the agreement, which could pose a challenge to the SPD's leadership in the upcoming elections. The decision by the U.S. and Germany to deploy missiles, at least on a rotating basis from a pure capability gap, was a logical decision, and it overshadowed Macron's criticism of the U.S. and German opposition to offering Ukraine NATO membership this year. This escalatory decision has elicited expected protests from Russia and represents another step towards the erosion of global stability. The U.S.-German alignment, along with U.S. alignments with Asian powers and closer cooperation with AUKUS, is also leaving France on the outside looking in. Western Europe is increasingly resembling the early 1980s, where the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union shaped decisions that affected Europe, granting them minimal influence due to their security concerns and France's self-imposed exclusion from NATO policy. The more things change, the more they stay the same.